Hi, everyone. I'm here today to tell you about a book that I just finished reading called The Secret Life of Groceries, and it's by Benjamin Lorr, who is an author and a journalist. He spent 5 years writing this book. I think there are some really interesting stories and insights that are relevant to the work that we're doing with our clients, and I want to share some of them with you so that you don't also have to go out and read the book unless you choose to do so. Some of the things I'm going to cover today, we don't have time to go over his entire book, but I'm pulling out the relevant stuff. I'm going to talk about the history of the supermarket. We'll look at Trader Joe's and how Trader Joe's differentiated itself against the run-of-the-mill supermarkets. And also I'm going to pull out some of the CPG brand insights and the journey of a new CPG brand. We'll talk about how a buyer evaluates new products and also some of the supply chain secrets and the dark side of the labor market that puts food into our grocery stores and on our tables. So one of the most interesting things that Benjamin Lorr said in the book is that he could not get a single grocery store executive to go on record and speak to him for this book. He spent 5 years researching it and writing it and had no luck. And one of the reasons, or the reason he thinks this is the truth, is because there's tons of trade secrets in this industry. The margins are razor thin in grocery. A profitable, well-run grocery store supermarket can expect to operate at a 1.5% margin. So those trade secrets are really important to these organizations, and folks were just not willing to talk. So he had to get really creative in how he did his research. I'll start a little bit by giving you the backstory. You know, we all are used to going to the grocery store, H-E-B or Randall's, Whole Foods, and just take it all for granted, but it wasn't always that way. Back in the 1800s, there were no grocery stores, there were no supermarkets, but there was a general store. And that's where people would go almost on a daily basis to buy food that they would prepare in their homes for their families. Most of the general stores operated on credit. So customers would go every day and get their stuff, but they might only settle up once or twice a year with the store. Then some of the biggest innovations of the 18th century were around packaging. So when the original folks were going to the general store, the clerks were helping them select the items, wrapping them up, putting them in a package, sending them off with the customer. But in the late 1800s, flat bottom paper bags became a thing. There were advances in canning. So in the past, things that had to be stored were mostly put into heavy glass jars, and then they started to go into tin cans. Cardstock was invented, so that allowed for cereal and cracker boxes to be made on an industrial scale. And also pre-cut, easy to fold cardboard boxes for shipping were introduced in the late 1800s. Previously, there was really no good way to ship goods at a long distance. So by 1900, packaged food was responsible for 1/5 of manufacturing in the United States. And once things started to be put into cans and boxes, that's when just basic anonymous products that were previously sold before became brands. One of the first branded items to sell like crazy was from Nabisco. The word Nabisco comes from the National Biscuit Company, and they launched a product called Unita Biscuit. And by 1900, more than 1 million packages of Unita biscuits had been sold. So fast forward a little bit to 1916, a gentleman by the name of Clarence Saunders, who had been working in these general stores, came up with some ideas for a new kind of store that allowed customers to self-serve rather than have to wait in line for the clerk to help them with stuff that was being kept behind the counter. Clarence Saunders was inspired by the cafeteria-style restaurants that were coming about at the same time, where people could just walk down a line and browse and select what they wanted to eat. He envisioned that being carried forward into the supermarket, and he created his own market. He envisioned customers walking down the aisles a one-way route past every item in the store, and he called his market the Piggly Wiggly. Other things that Saunders did that were new to the industry was he really was able to reduce labor costs and hire unskilled workers to stock the shelves. They didn't need to know what was in the box because the boxes were already telling the customers about that, or they were doing their branding outside of the grocery store. And he didn't need to have the skilled clerks that used to staff the general stores. Another invention of Clarence Saunders that was first pioneered at Piggly Wiggly was the separation of the entry and the exit in the store. When he first had Piggly Wiggly open, he was tracking about 6% of revenue was lost to theft. And this new way let people know that you can come in and you can look, but you can't leave without going past the checkout area where everyone's paying, and you're expected to pay. So it helped him reduce the amount of theft, and it set up kind of the modern retail experience that we all know today. Another fast forward was in 1930, more and more stores were operating like Piggly Wiggly. A gentleman by the name of Michael Cullen worked for Kroger at that time, and he began to envision stores that were bigger than these grocery stores. He pictured stores that were monstrous in size and imagined using volume to sell goods even cheaper than before. He was also the first person to come up with the idea of a loss leader, and he told his bosses at Kroger that they could sell milk at cost and still make profit on other things, like a can of peas or whatever else customers were coming for. So he tried to get this idea into the ownership at Kroger, and they just said, no, we're doing fine. We like how we're doing things. So he struck out on his own, and in 1930 in Queens, New York, he opened his first store called King Cullen. And it was the first supermarket, and it was a huge success. People came from 50 miles away to see his store because the prices were so cheap, they just couldn't believe it. People would line up to get into the store. Newspapers would cover openings of his new stores as they emerged because it was just such an exciting, unbelievable thing for people to get their groceries at such low prices, lower than anyone was selling them before. By 1936, he had 14 stores in the New York tri-state area, but he sadly dropped dead at the age of 52. But that didn't stop a lot of other people from copying his model. So there were stores called Big Bear, Giant Tiger, Bull Market, Great Leopard, all followed King Cullen, and they took his supermarket concept to another level. They added mascots. They had people in the stores in costumes. They piled merchandise high and created the end cap with 1,000 cans of soup. And the vision was the supermarket as a circus. This was a very exciting time, and things that we take for granted, people were excited to visit them for the first time. In 1937, another thing that helped with the supermarkets was shopping carts were introduced, where previously customers would just walk around with a basket and they couldn't really take that much home because they would get tired if they filled it too high. So fast forward again, by 1965, every grocery store was a supermarket. And it was no longer a sensation that would draw people from miles away. It was just the norm. Grocery stores became an institution. During this time, another thing that came about was the convenience store. Mid-19th century, there was a type of business that doesn't exist anymore today, but there were ice docks where small kind of gas station-like stations would have ice that people would drive by, and the ice would get hacked off a big block and packaged up and put into their truck or their car, and they would just drive in, get the ice, and drive out. And this actually happened in Texas. In the ice docks, people did not want to go in the middle of the day because it was hot. So one of the ice docks decided to expand their hours from 10 to 6. They went to 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And they also, at the request of some customers, decided to start selling milk, eggs, and bread. And 7-Eleven, as we know it, was born. By 1951, there were 100 stores of 7-Eleven, and it became Texas's largest retailer of beverages, milk, and bread, with $72 million in sales. So around this time, we'll go back to 1965 when the supermarkets were the norm. There was a gentleman by the name of Joe who had a small chain of convenience stores in California. They were called Pronto Markets. And he was a very quirky guy. He was Stanford educated, MBA. He had originally worked for some drugstores, and the drugstores decided to pilot some convenience stores, and then they decided they didn't want him anymore. So Joe bought out the convenience store chain, and he had his own little business with 7 stores. But unfortunately, as 7-Eleven was taking over the whole country, his Pronto Markets were not able to compete and keep up. They just couldn't offer the same prices, and he ended up selling Pronto Markets to 7-Eleven and was left thinking, what am I going to do now? How am I going to proceed and support my family? And he thought, I can't do grocery stores because I can't compete with 7-Eleven. I can't do supermarkets because everyone's in supermarkets. They're so big, I don't have enough capital. But he spent some time kind of looking at how things were changing in the world and noticed some trends in other industries that inspired him to start Trader Joe's. And one of the biggest insights that he had from running Pronto Markets was around continuity of products. And he was buying most of his products for his markets from a local distributor, same as all the other stores, but he did buy his eggs locally. And his egg guy came to him one time and said, "Hey, Joe, I've got a great deal for you. I have some extra large AAA eggs that I can sell to you for the same price as the AA large eggs that you usually get." And Joe thought, well, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. Those are much bigger eggs. It sounds like a more expensive product. And the broker admitted to him that he had a ton of these eggs, but he could not offload them. None of the traditional supermarkets were interested in his extra large eggs because they were a discontinuous product. They don't always have extra large eggs at that time. And they were afraid that at one point they wouldn't be able to get them and they would disappoint customers and they couldn't project the sales and it just didn't work for them. So that really stuck with Joe. He did take the extra large eggs, but he thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe there are other discontinuous products out there that I could sell that the supermarkets don't want. So fast forward again, Trader Joe's became the first grocery store of the 20th century. Everyone else was trying to go grocery to supermarket. He decides to go back to grocery. And part of Joe's obsession was creating a store that would appeal to an emerging class of well-educated, well-traveled people. A couple things that were going on in the world at that time. Air travel in the 60s became much, much more affordable with the innovations in planes and efficiency in air travel. And then more people started going to college. Back in the early 19th century, most people were blue collar tradesmen, and more people were going to college. And he just envisioned this group of educated, well-traveled folks wanting something different. He also became really obsessed with carrying products that had a very high value to their size. So for example, paper towels are not high value to their size. They're bulky and they're cheap. He decided to carry them, but only a few would go on the shelf at a time. He did focus on things like vitamins, coffee, maple syrup, nuts. He actually invented almond butter and wine to maximize the space in his stores with the most high value items. He also, a lot of us know Trader Joe's for their $2 chuck, but he was able to attract customers with his wine program, which was really unique at the time. He studied regulation about selling wine and importing wine, and domestic wines at that time in California, and I think the whole country in the 60s, had to be sold at the same price from store to store. You couldn't price your wine below the next guy, and attract customers that way. But the same did not apply for imported wines. So he got hooked up with the guy who imported wines from France and Italy, and he began to bring in some really interesting wines, and he priced them really, really cheap. And people flocked from all over to check out his imported wine selection, and they still have it in the store today. Another thing that he did differently was required his staff to have product knowledge to help sell the wines and the interesting kind of different stuff that he would have, and tell people about the eggs they couldn't get elsewhere, which was unlike the traditional grocery store. HEB, for example, doesn't have people who can tell you about the products. They're just there to stock the shelves, and the products like a Coca-Cola or Bounty paper towels, they tell you all about themselves. So another thing he did was he didn't allow sales reps to come in and bother his staff. He just had his buyers working hard at sourcing the best products at the best value. He started his stores, he had 15,000 SKUs in the store, and over time he whittled that down to just about 1,500 SKUs to focus on the high quality, low price, great value that they're known for today. The other thing he turned his nose up at was loss leaders. Every single product in Trader Joe's contributes to the bottom line. There is not a single loss leader in that store. And he ended up selling Trader Joe's to the brothers who owned Aldi, a German supermarket chain, in the late 1970s. But he stayed on for a while running the company. He has since moved on, but the core values and principles of that store still remain intact. And today, Trader Joe's has the single highest sales per square foot of any retail grocery chain and doubles its nearest competitor, which is Whole Foods. So I'm going to move on to tell you a little bit more about the CPG brand journey. And one of the first things that jumped out at me reading through kind of CPG brands and what they go through is how high the failure rate of new product launches is. 20,000 new products hit the shelf each year. 89% of those products that hit the shelf are gone within 18 months. And that's actually just the failure rate of the brands that hit the shelf in the grocery stores. Some of them don't even make it there. There's other products that sell at local markets, farmers markets, and they're just not able to get that shelf space to start with. So it is very challenging to start a CPG brand that succeeds. One of the quotes that jumped out to me in the book, I'm going to read it word for word, is to understand this rate of failure, the failure of the products that got their act together enough to succeed, you have to understand one big thing that most starting food entrepreneurs do not. Grocery doesn't just make its money off people buying things in stores, it makes its money off its vendors. And we'll get to that a little bit more in the future. The buyers at the grocery store have a lot of power. And when you're a new CPG brand and thinking about pitching your product and getting on the shelves, most brands think about their food and their product and how good it tastes and what its ingredients are made with and the nutritional value and how customers are going to respond. They're going to love it. The buyers don't really care about that stuff. Buyers aren't looking for food that tastes good. They're looking for products that will help them meet their financial goals. They are given sales goals. They have to increase sales in their category as part of their job, and they're looking for ways that they can do that. Things that buyers are looking for include products with a long shelf life, consistency in production, low commodity ingredient prices. That's why we see xanthan gum and corn syrup and everything. Buyers are tasked with growing their category. They're very data-driven, very revenue-driven. The two numbers that matter more than anything to a grocery buyer are total sales dollars and gross profit. This literally matters 50 times more than everything else, according to Lorr. Another quote that stuck out to me in the book, I'm going to read it word for word, is about the merchant-supplier negotiation. And Lorr says, he actually quoted someone who would not speak to him on record about how these negotiations usually go. The merchant-supplier negotiation is one of the great bastions of subtextual conversation. People are saying words, but nobody really knows what those words mean. It's a subtle probing for information, a giant butt sniffing, like two dogs in the park circling each other, trying to figure out if they have what the other wants. At almost every chain, also shocking, buyers work on rotation and they get moved into a new category every 2 years. This is an intentionally destabilizing strategy that keeps the buyers from making personal relationships with the vendors, and in particular with the billion-dollar companies that will have historically started to offer bribes to the buyers as soon as a relationship is formed to keep their products on the shelf. These buyers, as they rotate, they do not know the competing items in their category very well. They don't know the supply chain. They don't know the best prices. And they're overwhelmed with small new companies trying to pitch them new products. One buyer at a small chain in the Northeast reported getting 30 to 40 cold calls a day and spending 6 to 8 hours of his day in vendor meetings. Whole Foods National gets 500 new product samples each month. So if you're a young brand pitching to a buyer, you have to think about how to stand out, but also don't just tell them about your product. You've got to know what they need. Think about their numbers, their dollars, the shelf life of your product, the needs of the store, and focus your pitch on that, not why the customer is going to love the taste of your good food. Back to the part about grocery making money off their vendors and not just their customers. Buyers, focused on meeting their revenue goals, they really have 3 levers. The number one thing they can do is change their product mix, which is why they do take calls and evaluate new products. The number 2 thing they can do is lean really hard on their existing suppliers to lower prices or subsidize promotions that help move products off the shelf. The third thing that they do often is demand payment from brands in exchange for putting the items on the shelf. The grocery store, it's not fair. It is a pay to play system. And brands are not just fighting their competitors, they're fighting to stay on the shelf at the store. In 2015, what we know as trade spend added up to $76 billion taken in by retailers. Trade spend is the number 2 cost for a food entrepreneur, just below cost of raw goods. On average, trade spend is 12 to 18% of revenue. Slotting fees, which is the initial fee that a new brand has to pay just to get on the shelf, adds up to $9 billion a year in industry profit. This money also offsets the risk for the grocery store to take on a new brand. If the brand is paying $1,000 to have a tiny spot on the shelf to put some new products up there, well, if it doesn't sell, the grocery store didn't lose anything. They got the money from the slotting fee. They're not taking the risk. They're giving the risk to the food brand. And the food brands might pay $50,000 in slotting fees just to get into 50 new stores. And then they might be out the products and the $50,000. So they're really passing the risk along. And this kind of thing is important to understand if you think you're going to start a new CPG food brand. Other types of trade spend can be used responsibly to grow a brand, but too much of it or the wrong type can also be destructive. In addition to slotting fees, there's promotional fees, which are 2-for-1 sales, price breaks, discounts. Some grocery stores will ask for a free fill, which is they require a free case of product for every 10 that they buy that they get to sell for 100% profit. And then a lot of folks, we've seen this from KeHE, charge advertising fees, $1,250 a month for a mandatory placement in the company's internal newsletter. Talk about BS. Anyway, there's a huge initial startup cost for new brands. The trade magazine Frozen and Refrigerated Buyer estimates the cost of a national rollout for every single frozen SKU is $1.5 million. An example of a cold refrigerated brand, Chobani, we all know for Greek yogurt. Chobani was not the first and not really the best company to bring Greek yogurt to this market. They just happened to be the one with the most money. And here we are. So moving on to some details about the supply chain, there was a lot of stuff in this book that I just don't have time to go into. Stories about the truckers who drive the trucks to and from the distribution centers and help move our groceries along the road. There were a lot of stories about folks who are not treated fairly working in retail establishments, working for suppliers. There's a lot of dirty stuff behind the scenes, and I'm just going to highlight a little bit of it. And the way the author explained what's happening in the supply chain, we think, God, these are terrible practices. These people, why aren't they being treated better? Well, what he says is that, as customers, we demand low price and high quality, and we want it now. But we balk at the solutions the industrial food complex has created to deliver on what we want. And that's something that, we have to reckon with a little bit. But anyway, start talking back to the distribution centers. Benjamin Lorr was not able to get a job at a distribution center, which is what he first tried to do. So he rode along with a trucker who was bringing a load of product into an Aldi distribution center. And when that trucker was backed up, unloading the products, having them quality checked, he snuck out and went and looked around the center. And what he says, I'm going to read this word for word, because I like this quote, is that the big lie here is that the warehouse is just a location for passive storage where items sit around and get retrieved as necessary. The truth is that perishable grocery is closer to a NICU ward at the hospital, blazing technology furiously working to sustain life. He reports seeing piles of green bananas, rock hard avocados, unripe tomatoes that are as hard as a baseball, being kept in suspension and then fast forwarded towards ripe when they're needed. A fresh apple has apparently been sitting dormant for close to a year. And the core of this kind of control comes from regulating ethylene, which is a gaseous plant hormone. Suppressing ethylene keeps fruit in a suspended state of development. And also in the case of apples, wax will do the same thing. So another thing he talked a lot about was co-packers and the impact that co-packers can have on ingredients and how ingredients break into the supply chain. So he interviewed a co-packer in North Carolina talking about the difference between working with commonly used ingredients and hard to get ingredients. And he said that, for example, if somebody wants to use a cocoa that comes from Egypt, it's going to take a long time for him to get it. It's going to be expensive, and he might not even want to make that product because he doesn't want to get the ingredients. But once something breaks in to the supply chain, it's much, much easier to get, and folks tend to choose ingredients from the list of what other people are using because it's cheaper and easier to get. So for example, all of a sudden we have avocado oil in popcorn, in crackers, in mayonnaise. 5 years ago that wasn't the case, but it's now in the mix and everybody's using it. Back to some of the labor practices, a couple of the highlights that were most disturbing. And we know this not just from grocery, but from retail and kind of working class stories in general. But even at the case of Whole Foods, for example, retail employees are getting whittled on both ends, Lorr says. For example, they're expected to be available at all times because the store uses just-in-time scheduling. They might not have their schedule more than 2 days in advance, but they also can't go get a second job because they have to be on call for the Whole Foods job. And Whole Foods is intentionally, a lot of places do this, keeping employees just below the 30-hour mark so that they're part-time and not full-time and they don't have to receive benefits. Some of the supplier labor is much, much worse. This book goes into a great detail about a story of a young fisherman in Thailand who was conned into leaving his family in a small village. He was told he was by a labor broker that there was a job for him on a shrimping boat. If he would just come along and get on the boat, he would be trained, he would have room and board, and then after 3 months of training, he would start to be paid for his labor. So this young man and thousands, tens of thousands of others in Asia have done this. They get on the boats, and then after their training period is up, they realize there's no money, there's no pay. So they're on boats, they don't have the right papers, they're traveling around to different ports. And this the story of this one young man, he was on a shrimping boat based out of Thailand for 5 years, never got paid, wasn't treated well. And this kind of stuff happens all the time. And it's one of the ways that suppliers keep the prices down and give us shrimp at a price the average American can afford, which is, he makes the contrast that, 20 years ago, shrimp was a delicacy. It was something that you would have at a fancy cocktail party. You couldn't just go buy shrimp and throw it into everything, but now we can, and there's a dark side of how that's happening. On the flip side, Thailand was exposed for all these poor shrimping practices and slave labor, and they have since cleaned up their act. But those suppliers have now found that the buyers from the US have gone elsewhere to buy shrimp that's cheaper. So they can't win. And then finally, one of the stories, there was a gentleman, a former executive from Whole Foods, who went on record to talk about what happened when Amazon bought Whole Foods. And he said, as you know, the original leadership at Whole Foods said that they were never going to compete on price, because if you try to compete on price, there are two stakeholder groups